You know, earlier in the show, we showed you all a very difficult video out of Ohio, and I want to put some context to that video, and I think there's no better person to help me do that than Dr. Uhuru Williams. Thank you so much for joining us. You are a history expert. You also are doing so much work when it comes to policing in Minnesota, specifically Minneapolis, and really having the African American experience be properly documented. Tell me, what were your first reactions when you saw this video?
Deep disappointment, Alexis, but not surprise. I think, unfortunately, despite the conversation that was occasioned by the killing of George Floyd in 2020 and its discourse about policing practices, especially with regard to African Americans in the African American community, very little has changed. There's been a lot of dialogue about efforts toward reform, but unfortunately, it's something we've seen before. This impetus to try to create meaningful pathways to reform, but then videos like this that prove that these practices continue and continue to cost lives.
When it comes to this particular video, there's going to be a lot of people who will say, Alexis, it's too early to start having these conversations. We still need to understand what happened, what charges were made, all of those things, which is very true. But I think that when people watch this video, there's a visceral reaction that happens. And I want to talk about why that reaction happens for people who saw this and had a difficult time watching. Why do you think that is?
Because wounds produce narratives. And in communities of color, this is such a familiar scenario that we've seen over and over again. It's like a bad movie that replays. No matter what Frank Tyson ultimately will be, it'll be determined where the police's reason for engaging Frank Tyson. There's nothing about that encounter, at least that we can see from the body cam footage, that would make it seem like it was acceptable to engage in the level of brutality that they use to subdue him. And then we see this image of the knee yet again. 30 seconds applied to Frank Tyson's body. We hear him say, I can't breathe. We hear him ask the officer to remove his knee. And then we watch him lie there motionless with the officers and other patrons of the bar doing nothing to address this man who clearly is unconscious at this point. It's just very disturbing. I agree. There will be those who will say, we have to wait till all the evidence is out. There'll predictably be calls to look into Frank Tyson's background, his past criminal behavior. But I would argue, and I think it'll be true, most people will look at this, particularly in communities of color, particularly in the Black community, from the lens of, this is the wound again, here we go again.
And especially here in Minneapolis, my last question for you, you are specifically working with knowing how policing is happening, especially when it comes to Black people in our communities. Talk to me briefly about that work and how that correlates with what we saw today.
Well, what we look at in our Policing MSP project is the long history of police brutality in the African American community or against the African American community, Indigenous people in Minnesota. And this video reminded me of the case from 1899 of a woman named Ophelia Rice, who had a police officer, Thomas Britt, engage in an act of brutality against her, in which he placed his knee on her body. That's 1899. So when we talk about echoes of the past, these kind of long-standing wounds that the African American community experiences, it's the legacy of that past injustice that meets these present cases that remind us that we have a long way to go in terms of addressing systemic racism in terms of criminal justice in our country.
Dr. Williams, thank you so much for giving us perspective. And of course, I'm sure that this is one of many conversations we'll have in the near future.
Thanks for having me on, Alexis.